the thing that accurately, right? Like in sociology, something like that, you have very vague predictions, right? Huh? And of course, the scientists will say that a theory is more interesting when it predicts things that we didn't even know existed. And you find out later on that they do exist, right? Heisenberg went to England there and conferred with Dirac, who was a super mathematician and so on. And Dirac worked out some kind of mathematical theory and ended up with a negative electron coming out of his theory, right? His equations. Huh? Talking about negative electron, ain't no such animal. And then sometime later they discovered in experiments the positron, right? Which had the same mass, I guess, as electron, but the opposite charge, right? Here's the kind of particle that nobody knew existed, right? But it came out of the mathematics of Dirac. So it's strange, right? But in terms of the form of speech in which you confirm the hypothesis, right? If A is so, if my hypothesis is so, H is so, then P is so, right? P is so. It doesn't follow necessarily that what H is so. It's not a syllogism. There's some weakness there. Kind of syllogisms I used earlier when we were showing that not every genus has a genus above it, but that there are highest genera, right?
Well, you used a hypothetical sort of thing. Or not.
If every genus had a genus above it, there would never be most universal names, right? Okay. But there are most universal names, right? Like being and something, right? Therefore. Right? Now, you could have an either or if you wanted to. First, you could say either every genus is a species, that's one way of stating it, or there's a genus that's not a species, right? Or another way of stating it, either every genus has a genus above it, or not. There's a genus or genera that don't have anything above them, right? Gotta be one or the other, right? Now, we're eliminating one of those possibilities. That every genus has a genus above it, right? That every genus is a species of a higher genus, right? I say now, what follows from that? That would what? Recognize the as false, right? What would follow from it is that there would be no most universal name. Because the genus is always said of more than a species. So if every genus has a genus above it, there's always a name said of more than any name. Okay? But how can there be something said of more than being or something? Could there be something that isn't something? Could there be something that isn't a being? No, whatever it is has to be. So the fact that you come to most universal names means that you're denying the consequent right of every genus having a genus above it, right? I might also argue, that if every genus has a genus before it, then every definition has a definition before it, right? And therefore we know nothing by definition, right? So we use these forms without maybe recognizing that we're using them, right? And you wonder when they call Aristotle the father of logic, right? Because he's the first man to think out the basic parts of logic. And but now when you see Socrates, reasoning that way, right? You say, well, he uses the two forms of if-then speech that are syllogisms, right? He avoids the other forms. Does he know that explicitly, or does he just... Okay. Doesn't go the other way, right? There seems to be, men must have reasoned to some extent before they reflected upon what they're doing, right? And you'll see in the dialogues of Plato, you won't see the explicit definition of syllogism, but Socrates will say, well, now, if these things are so, then isn't this necessarily so? And someone will say, yeah, I guess so, But you anticipate the definition of syllogism, right? These things being so, well, then this must be so, then, yeah, I guess so, yeah. And we'll do that in daily speech, right? And the philosopher comes back. But often in daily speech, too, we're deceived. We have to stop and understand these things. Later on there, Socrates, mind can't rest in contradiction, right? So you've got virtue can be taught, virtue cannot be taught, right? They can't both be true, can they? Okay. So now Socrates says, well, they can't both be true. There must be a defect in one of the arguments, right? Okay. Now I mentioned how in another dialogue with Protagoras, he questions this second premise here. There are no teachers of virtue, right? Okay. Because your mother and your father would give you those lessons in justice, wouldn't they, right? Okay. And an example I always give, from children, you'll find you maybe did yourself, or find your own children do it. They're in the store and they'll take a piece of candy, right, from the thing, without paying for it, right? And the mother or father, you march the kid back to the store, you have to give it back to the clerk, right? Mm-hmm. And it makes a great impression upon the kid, right? He doesn't think it's eating it yet, right? So that's a little lesson in what? In justice, right? Okay. And you get a box of candy for your birthday from grandma or from aunt so-and-so, and well, stuff is, and your mother says, now you've had enough for today, right? We'll put it away, we'll have some more tomorrow. That's a lesson in what? Temperance, yeah, moderation, right? Okay. But Socrates doesn't, point it out in this dialogue, right? Okay. And what's marvelous about the dialogues is that they observe this aspect of our mind that we see a part of the truth before the whole truth. And you'll see, part of the truth of this dialogue, maybe another dialogue, another part of the truth, right? And put it all together, or Aristotle was put together, we don't know. But we see the parts there in Plato, in Aristotle. So, Socrates comes back and he thinks he sees the weakness here in what? His second premise, right? But going back to the argument, that what directs us to the good is knowledge. He sees that statement is not necessarily true. Now, there's another possibility for directing someone to the good, and that is what is called right opinion. Correct opinion. Now, opinion is not knowledge, right? Okay. An opinion may be true or false, but we're talking now about a true opinion, right? Okay. Now, I always take a very simple example. I say, suppose you're going down the road here, and you want to get to Boston, right? Okay. You come to the fork in the road. Okay. And one of these is leading to Boston, the other one leading to, let's say, Providence, okay? Vouch for the accuracy of this map here. Okay. Now, I come to the fork in the road here, right? And I want to get to Boston. Let's assume it's good to go to Boston, right? Okay. Now, if I know that the right road here, I suppose the left one here, if I know that's the right road, the correct one, right? I would take that one, right? And I'll get to Boston, right? Now, suppose I get to that fork in the road and I don't know which is the one to take. But I think that this is the road to Boston. Okay? I don't know. I think it is. I'm going to take that road, right? Okay. In this case, I'm thinking correctly. I have the right opinion, right? But I don't know, right? Okay. So I'll get to Boston just as much as the man who what? Knows, right? Okay. Sometimes people, they win the money in the lottery, right? And why do you play those numbers? It's kind of interesting. Sometimes they're our grandchildren's numbers and like that, right? But sometimes that number was showing up in their life somehow, right? Okay. So they had a hunch to play these numbers, right? And these numbers are the numbers that came in, and now they run about some of the money, right? Okay. Now, if they had known that these numbers were going to win this Friday, then they would have played them and won some money, right? But having a hunch that these are the numbers to play also directed them to play those numbers, right? And they got just as wealthy as they would if they had known their numbers, right? Okay. So the right opinion, right thinking, can get you to the good just as well as knowledge. So maybe the great men of Athens directed Athens to the good, not by knowing what was good for Athens, but by having the right opinion as to. Okay. You see that comment there, right? They say that MacArthur's, greatest military coup was the Inchon landing, right? Okay. I read many accounts of the Inchon landing, the planning for it, and so on. And Washington was ill disposed to this plan, the Inchon landing, right? And they sent the chief of staff down to try to convince MacArthur not to do it. And they sent a top admiral down to convince him not to do it, right? The Navy can't do it, right? Okay. And then MacArthur, very persuasive man, right? Yeah, I have more confidence in the Navy, sir, than you have, and so on. And now, it was a great thing what MacArthur did, right? And after the success of the Inchon landing, the troops down on the beaches and so on, were pushing the sea, they saw the enemy just starting to weaken away, fade away, right? Collapse. And he said, okay, now, did MacArthur know that the Inchon landing was going to succeed? Or did he think it was going to succeed, right? And thought correctly. Because apparently Inchon landing was a very risky thing, right? And the tide, you read the description of the tides, and it's a very short amount of time you can come in, and all kinds of things, right? And MacArthur had maybe, they set a plan to withdraw if he didn't succeed, or little be lost except my reputation, he says. And well, anyway, they finally allowed MacArthur to go ahead, right? Reluctantly, right? But then on the day he was going ahead with it, they sent a message that he was on his own. They denied all their responsibility for it. So the whole burden was on MacArthur. And MacArthur, they call up he's on the boat, they're going, and he calls up his subordinate, and he goes through the whole plan again, right? That's what he's going to do, MacArthur says, right? And he sits down and starts reading his Bible, and that's what he do. He sits down and read the Bible after that. And of course, it's great success, right? Well, did MacArthur know it was going to succeed? Or he just had the hunch, the right instinct, right? In either case, he led us to the good, right? Okay, you see that, huh? So Socrates says, maybe the great men of Athens led Athens to good things, not by knowing, but by having the right opinion or the right hunches, right? The right instincts, as we say. But you can't really teach somebody, maybe the right opinion and the right instincts, so you can't teach them a hunch, right? See? So maybe that's what they had, right? Now, Socrates later on, he'll put this more formally, he'll say, the great men of Athens led or directed Athens to the good, either by knowledge or by what? Right opinion, right? And then he eliminates that they led them to it by knowledge, because if they know, then they could have taught, right? But they couldn't teach, therefore they didn't know. That's the now the consequence, and now the antecedent, right? But he also has neither argument, right? Now he's concluding that they must have led the city of Athens to the good through what? Right opinion. So he's using the either or, and again backing it up with the if then what argument. So you can find in that passage all of these kinds of syllogisms, either or, and the if then, and even that first one we had, what directs us to the good is knowledge, virtue directs us to the good. You have a very, very kind of syllogism, right? So men were syllogizing before Aristotle thought out the art of the syllogism, but sometimes, like an example, Milesis there, right? Milesis argues that if being had a beginning, it has an end. If being has no beginning, it's reason for saying that, therefore it has no end, right? So he's arguing from the form of if-then speech that is not a syllogism, and Aristotle points this out in the first book of Natural Hearing. But Socrates is arguing from the two that are what? That are syllogisms. Huh? Now, I try to, when I teach students, I try to get them to be very much aware of these four forms of if-then speech and why two of them are what? And two are not, and two are valid. And the fact that one of these valid forms is what? Obvious. And through the obvious one, you show the form that is not obvious, right? But the form that is not obvious, in a way you use that in showing the two ones that are not. Right? Because notice the way we reason. We reason that if something is necessarily so, then it's always so. But it's not always so, as the example shows. Therefore, it's not necessarily so. You see that? So you're using the if-then syllogism that's not so obvious, the denial of the consequent, how you have to see it, in order to see that we've really shown that those two forms are what? Invalid, right? Huh? So, just diagram it a little bit here. You take the obvious here, which is most known, that if A is so, then B is so, A is so, therefore B is so, right? Okay. Now we use that to show the not obvious form. If A is so, then B is so, B is not so, therefore A is not so. Notice how we did that. We said either A is so or A is not so, right? And if A were so, then by the first case, B would have to be so, right? So if A is so, B is not so, and A is so, those three statements are not what? Compatible, are they? Because if A is so, then B is so, and A is so together contradict B is not so by the first case. So by the first case, we see that it's impossible that A is so and B is not so. And therefore, it must be that A is not so and B is not so. Right? Okay. Then we come down to those other forms that are not syllogisms. If A is so, then B is so, and A is not so. And the other form, if A is so, B is so, B is so, right? Now, to be complete, you have to show an example where it is not so, but just take the one where people are more apt to be deceived. They're apt to think that if A is not so, that B is not so, right? Huh? Okay. Now, if that were necessarily so, it would always be so. But it's not always so. For example, if I'm a dog, then I'm an animal. I am not a dog, therefore I'm not an animal. Oh, okay. So it isn't always so that B is not so, right? Okay. It might be so if I'm a man, I'm an animal. Excuse me. Yeah. If I'm a dog, I'm go for an animal, right? Okay. So, I'm showing that since this is invalid, through examples, why are the examples enough? The examples show it isn't always so, and if it isn't always so, that shows it isn't necessarily so. But in a way, I'm using this second form, right? If it's necessarily so, it's always so. But it isn't always so. Therefore, it isn't necessarily so. Now, the same way over here, right? If A is so, B is so, B is so. If I am a dog, I'm an animal. If I'm a man, I'm an animal. May not be so that A is so, right? So again, the examples show it's not always so, and there you're denying the consequence of something being necessarily so. Therefore, your report being necessarily so. Now, sometimes, and you see this in Euclid, sometimes you might have several of these syllogisms run together, right? You might say, if A is so, B is so. If B is so, C is so. C is not so, therefore B is not so, therefore what? A is not so. But you just run together several syllogisms. The domino effect we used to talk about, right? Okay? But no matter how far you go down the line, if A is so, B is so, if B is so, C is so, if C is so, D is so, right? If you eventually reach something that is not so, then everything before that gets what? Turned over, right? Okay? But that's just what? What we call continuous syllogisms, right? It's like the domino theory, right? Whoever the last one, all the rest go over. Okay. The same way if you're looking before, right? I have to start later on the alphabet. Let's say I want to show that D is so. I find out if C is so, then D is so. But I don't know that C is in fact so. But then I see that if B is so, then C will be so. But I don't know in fact B is so. But then if A is so, then B is so. And I do know that A is so, therefore B is so, therefore C is so, therefore D is so, right? Okay? But notice you're looking before and after, as Shakespeare says, right? So you might keep on looking before until you get to something you know is so, right? And then you can syllogize right down the line. Or you might keep on looking afterwards until you come to something that is not so, right? Okay? In a sense, Euclid is doing that in that theorem we're talking about, right? If one of those two sides of the triangle, remember, where the angles were equal, if one of the sides is longer, then from the longer side you can cut off a what? Line equal to lesser. And if you can do that, then you can draw a line from that endpoint to the other, right? And if you have that, then you have two triangles, right, which have equal angles containing equal sides. Therefore, they're equal, right? But they can't be equal, right? So you might have several steps, right? Okay? So as you go on these theorems in Euclid, you might have several steps it goes through. This is so, that'll be so, this so, this so. But you're just repeating the same argument, the same kind of argument, I should say, right? We might not, bother to make explicit the whole syllogism, right? If I say, if A is so, B is so, if B is so, C is so, but A is so, therefore C is so. But I don't bother to say, but B is so. Spell for argument. But it's basically the same syllogism repeated several times, the same kind of syllogism. I call these syllogisms continuous, but the conclusion of one is a premise in the next one, right? If A is so, B is so. A is so, therefore B is so. If B is so, C is so. If B is so, with the previous argument, therefore C is so, right? Sometimes you think it's being so obvious, you don't even bother to spell it out, right? Just if A is so, B is so, B is so, C is so. But A is so, therefore C is so. Okay. But in fact, you're showing from A is so that B is in fact so, and from B being in fact so, and C is in fact so. Tout est clair? Tout est clair? Things clear?
So Aristotle doesn't explicitly do this, does he?
Well,
he just thought it was obvious.
He talks about it very explicitly, yeah. There's not a book on the... Berquist has a book on the hypothetical syllogism, right? He complicates it more than is necessary, right? I think it's simple enough to consider 4 possibilities, right? And 2 of which are and 2 are not, right? But he'll maybe multiply it depending on what the statements are, what? Affirmative or negative, right? Okay. So I say if you deny the consequent, you have to deny the antecedent. Whether the consequent is an affirmative or negative statement to multiply all these things unnecessarily complicates it. Huh? In dialectic, when you study the tools of dialectic, the fourth tool of dialectic is the tool of likeness. And Aristotle says the mind is exercised more in seeing a likeness between things that are further apart, and seeing the likeness of ratios. Okay. I was doing the first chapter in class of nature this morning. Aristotle is talking about how the confused is more known than the distinct, right? And he's talking about how when we taste a salad dressing or hear a symphony or see a painting, we don't distinguish the parts clearly at first. Then he makes a direct comparison between whole and part and general and particular, right? Okay? And he's seeing a proportion there. He wants to show that the general is known before the particular, the more universal before the less universal. And he's showing that the whole is known before the parts. Well, he's saying that in a way the general is to the particular as the whole is to the what? Parts. And sometimes they call the general the universal whole instead of its parts, rather than opposing it, right? But the English word particular there obviously comes from the word part, right? So the particulars are like parts, right? And in Greek there, the word for general is kapalou. Like the word capital. But kapalou in Greek comes from the Greek word for whole. Kata, holas, according to the whole. They run together, two words. So the Greek word for general is taken from the Greek word for whole, and the word particular here in English is taken from the word part, right? So the general, in a way, is the particular, like the whole is to the part, right? So, you might reason then that if the whole is known before the parts, then the general is known before the what? Yeah, makes sense, right? Yeah. But we know that, in fact, the whole is known before the parts, right? When I taste the salad dressing the first time, I don't pick out the different ingredients, the herbs and so on used there, right? When I hear a symphony the first time, I don't pick out the oboes and the clarinets and the violin and the viola and so on, right? Okay? Now, when you study the regular syllogism, you'll see that you have three terms in the regular syllogism. Like in the one we had there from the Meno there. Every what? What directs us to the good is knowledge, right? Virtue directs us to the good, therefore virtue is knowledge. You have one term used twice there, what they call a middle term, right? But in proportion, you have four terms, right? So you want to reason from a proportion, you put it in the form of a what? If-then statement, right? You get four terms. And notice how the mathematician will argue sometimes. You'll see that x is to y as a is to b. Okay? And then you can form propositions. If x is equal to y, then a is equal to b. If x is more than y, then a is more than b, right? We saw Shakespeare reason that way, right? In the exhortation to use reason, right? What kind of if-then syllogism is Shakespeare implicitly giving there? What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast no more, right? What is he saying?
And then you say he's not a beast.
Yeah, but the original proportion is that the chief good of man is to man, as the chief good of the beast is to the beast. Then, like in math, we alternate the proportion. As the chief good of man is to the chief good of the beast, so man is to the beast. Then you say, if the chief good of man is no more than the chief good of the beast, being distinct and feed, then man is no more than the beast. Well, we all know that man is more than the beast. And if the man says he doesn't know that, we'll treat him like a beast and put him in a cage and so on, and he'll rave and rant, he's more than the beast, right? Everything I am. You see? Okay? So notice the way he's reasoning there, huh? From the now the consequent, right? If the chief good of man is no more than the chief good of the beast, then man should be no more than the beast. But man is more than the beast, right? He denies the thing. In the second part of education, he points out what man has, the beast doesn't have any ability to look before and after. Ability to have discourse and so on, right? Okay. But notice, you could take some of these things and you could argue the other way around. You could say, if man is more than the beast, then the chief good of man is more than the chief good of the beast. But man is more than the beast, therefore the chief good of man is more than the chief good of the beast, right? Then you're using the first and the obvious form, right? Okay? But Shakespeare seems to be using there more of the what? The not obvious form, right? He's saying, if the chief good of man is no more than the chief good of the beast, then man is no more than the beast. But you know that isn't true. Therefore, the chief good of man must be something more than sleep and feed. Make sure I understand these things naturally. After I studied logic, right? For instance, very well. They argue to the purpose of man, we do this, we use sometime in this then argument, We'll use that for there. I'll say, what is to man as seeing is to the eye? What is to man as seeing is to the eye? Yeah, see, if I ask you, what is to the ear as seeing is to the eye, what would you say? Yeah, you take the act that characterizes the ear, right? That's peculiar to it, right? What is to man as seeing is to the eye? What's the act that involves reason in some way? Okay? Then you syllogize for the more known. If seeing is the what? Purpose of the eye, then the act with reason is the purpose of man. But everybody knows that in fact seeing is the purpose of the eye. Therefore the act with reason must be the purpose of man. Or you come back and you say, what is to man as seeing well is to the eye? What's the act with reason done well, right? So if the purpose of the eye is not just to see, but to see well, then the purpose of man must be the act with reason done well, right? But everybody knows the purpose of the eye is to see well, right? That's what give us glasses. Therefore, the purpose of man must be the act with reason done well. So we can syllogize, So this is, you can use the if-then syllogism with 4 terms. You can't use a regular syllogism. And notice, you can always put, the other form into the if-then. Instead of saying, what do you say? If, let's say 3 is odd, and what is odd is not even, therefore 3 is not even. You might say if 3 is odd, then it's not even. If 3 is odd, therefore it's not even. You can put The thing with 3 terms isn't an if-then syllogism. With 4 terms, you can't put it into the other form. But you put it in the if-then form. So it's a very common form, so it's good to know this, right? Now, next time we're going to go, I got to run off here. Next time we're going to go into the, next group of reading. You have the next group of readings, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's called the form of the simple syllogism, but it's not so simple, right? Okay? And there, instead of 4 cases, if you want to be complete, we have to consider 48. Okay? Most of which I consider in this thing. And all of them. We go through all of them, right? Okay? So we save, the worst to last. Okay. That's part of the reason why I do it this way, right? So the kind of obvious form, the either or, and the if then is a little more deceptive in some cases. And then we go to the
Does your schedule change sometimes every week, or do you have?
I can go, this stuff here on second nature to me now.
Yeah, okay.
Brother Richard taught me logic when I was in high school, so I went to college, took the exam, and they gave me credit for the course,
Oh.
So I've done logic and stuff. Do it in my sleep. Our scripture there, we have to do it more. So in school I needed 2 weeks of that, to that read and review for it becomes second nature to me now,
Thought it was your
This stuff
school
here.
schedule or something. Yeah, just for your own
Okay, so next Tuesday we'll. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. God, our enlightenment, guardian angels, strengthen the lights of our minds, order and illumine our images, and arouse us to consider more quickly. St. Thomas Aquinas, angelic doctor,
Pray for us.
and help us to understand all the truth. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. So today we're going to look at the form of the syllogism, which Aristotle simply calls the syllogism, right? And in a way, if you look at the definition of syllogism, it's speech in which some statements laid down, another follows necessarily because of those laid down. In the regular syllogism here, the conclusion is in no way really in the premises, actually, right? It's in the power of the premises, right? In the case of the either or, it's already there, but not yet asserted, right?
Oh, yeah.
In the case of the if-then statement, it's already there, but not yet said in fact to be so.
Right.
But here when you have this simple syllogism, like an example there, every animal is alive, every man is an animal, well, the conclusion, every man is alive, is not actually found in the premises. So the idea that the conclusion is another statement, right, from what's on the premises, is more true in the syllogism than in the if-then syllogism or the either-or syllogism, right? Just seeing a nice either-or syllogism this morning in Thomas Aquinas. He's reasoning that the relation of God to creatures is not a real relation, but a relation of reason. And he says, well, if it's a real relation in God, it either have to be an accident in God, or it had to be the very substance of God, right? Well, in the first book, the previous party showed there are no accidents in God, right? So if it isn't the accident, it'd have to be the very substance of God, and then his very substance would be towards the creature, and there'd be some dependence of God upon the creature there to be. And we've shown in the first book that he's what's necessary to be through himself, right? So it's beautiful the way he's, there are two possibilities, right? Either it's something existing in God but not what he is, or it is what he is. And it excludes both possibilities, therefore it can't really be in God. So, okay. Now, we recall the definition of syllogism. Now, in the regular syllogism, we take it apart. And Aristotle wrote 2 books, which in English are called the prior and the posterior analytics. 2 books about demonstration, the kind of syllogism you have in geometry and elsewhere to some extent too.
And in the prior analytics, which means before, analytic means take apart in a sense. He takes apart these arguments to see if the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. And then the posterior analytics, he takes them apart again to see if the premises are necessarily what? True.
Right.
Okay? And that's, as we said, is proportional to a man checking his calculation to see if he added or subtracted correctly or multiplied correctly, and then checking to see that he had in fact the correct numbers. Huh? Okay? To add or subtract. Huh? So, when you take apart the syllogism, we'll call this the syllogism period now, this syllogism, you always find that it has two premises. Huh? Okay. Now, if you take the premises apart into their subject and predicate, you find not 4 different terms, but what? 3, right? There's one term that is found in both premises, huh? And then 2 that are found just in one, right? Okay. And that term that is found in both is going to if it's really a syllogism, it's going to enable you to put together the other 2, right, in an affirmative statement, or separate them in a negative statement. Huh? And so we sometimes compare the middle term to the middleman in economics, right? And it's inconvenient for, let's say, the consumer to get together in many cases with the producer, right? So there's a man then who has a shop and he has contact with the producer and he has contact with the consumer who comes into his shop. So he kind of brings them together, right? Okay. Or like a matchmaker, right? I knew someone who thought this man and woman were just right for each other. And so he arranged to have a party at which everybody there was a married couple except for these 2. So they, of course, necessity there, they started talking, and they were very suited for each other. And in a week or so, they knew they were going to get married, They did eventually get married, and get married and have children. So he's what? He knew the guy for his work, and he knew the woman, and he just said, "There's 2, just, Okay? So that's what the middle term is a little bit like that. Okay? But then sometimes, too, you have 2 guys fighting, and somebody comes in and referee, and separates them, right? And that's like the negative statement, right? You separate. This is not that, right? Okay? Now, that middleman, or that middle term as they call him in logic, he can have 3 relations to the terms. Huh? He can be, as it were, in between the 2, right? The subject of one of them and the predicate set of the other. Or he can be what? The predicate in both cases, said or denied of the other 2. Or he can be the what? Subject, right? Okay. Now, when Aristotle does this, he actually uses, in the Greek, if you look at it, he uses different letters for these 3 arrangements. Huh? And to examine that in English, he said, well, in this first figure, as he calls it, the middle term is in the middle position, right? And then in the second figure, that middle term is the what? Predicate in both cases. Huh? Okay, the predicate seems to be more universal than the subject usually. We're more apt to say man is an animal than an animal is man, right? In the third figure, the middle term is what? The subject, right? Okay. But now we're sometimes accustomed, and when we do it like in here, to use A, B, and C for all 3 arrangements, right? But then you have to realize that the order of the letters doesn't necessarily correspond to the order of the terms, right? It does in the first, right? But not in the second and the third. Okay. So, using the same letters, then let's say you have this arrangement, and he calls that arrangement the first figure. And then you have this arrangement, where the middle term